There was this dusty hill town with maybe 400 people where everyone knows everyone's business, where Roman soldiers patrol the nearby roads, and where a young carpenter named Jesus spent 30 years of his life before changing the world forever. But here's what's fascinating. The Bible barely mentions Nazareth, yet this small village shaped the Son of God in ways that would determine the entire course of human history. What was it really like to live in Jesus' neighborhood? What did he see every day walking those ancient streets? And why did God choose this specific place, despised by the religious elite, to raise the Savior of the world? Though before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Thank you for joining me today. As always, I'd love to hear where you're watching from. Let us know in the comments and share what time it is for you there. It really makes us feel like the global community it is. Now, let's dive into today's story, shall we? The Hidden Village, introducing the town that shaped a savior, stand at the edge of a limestone ridge in Lower Galilee. Below you spreads a shallow basin ringed by hills that catch the morning sun. A handful of stone houses cluster near a spring. Terraced fields climb the slopes. Olive trees twist their ancient trunks toward the sky. This is Nazareth in the first century. Small, quiet, forgotten by nearly everyone who mattered. Yet this village, barely a footnote in the records of its time, became the home of Jesus of Nazareth. The man who would reshape human history grew up here. He learned to walk on these limestone paths. He worked with his hands in these streets. The question that burns through centuries asks itself again: what was life truly like in this place? The Gospels call Nazareth his patris. The word means more than hometown. It carries the weight of identity, of belonging, of the soil that shapes who you become. Every person bears the mark of their patris. The landscape seeps into your bones. The rhythm of seasons becomes your rhythm. The way your neighbors speak becomes your voice. Nazareth shaped Jesus in ways we often overlook. We speak of the incarnation as God becoming human. But the incarnation was more specific than that. God became a first-century Galilean craftsman from an obscure village that most people had never heard of. The Son of God spoke with a Nazarene accent. He knew the taste of Nazarene water from the village spring. He understood the particular struggles of subsistence living in a Roman-occupied backwater. This specificity matters. The Christian faith does not begin with abstract philosophy. It begins with dust under fingernails and calluses on palms. It begins with a real place where real people ground grain and repaired plows and watched the sunset behind the same hills their grandparents had watched. Nazareth was so small it appears in no ancient records before the Gospels mention it. Josephus, the great Jewish historian who cataloged nearly every settlement in Galilee, never names it. The Hebrew Bible, spanning thousands of years of history, maintains complete silence about Nazareth. The Talmud would later list 63 Galilean towns. Nazareth does not appear among them. The village sat tucked in its basin like a secret. The main roads passed nearby but not through. Sepphoris, the gleaming capital of Galilee, lay just an hour's walk to the northwest. Caravans traveled the trade routes that connected the Mediterranean coast to the inland regions. But these routes bypassed Nazareth. If you wanted to reach the village, you had to intend to go there. No one stumbled upon Nazareth by accident. This obscurity shaped the people who lived there. They were not cosmopolitan. They were not sophisticated in the eyes of urban dwellers from Jerusalem or Rome. They spoke Aramaic with a thick Galilean accent that marked them as provincial. They were farmers and craftsmen who knew their place in the Roman world's hierarchy. That place was near the bottom, yet something profound happened in this nowhere place. The angel Gabriel appeared to a young woman named Mary. The message he brought would echo through eternity. The Word became flesh not in the marble halls of Rome, not in the temple complex of Jerusalem, but in a small house in a village so insignificant that people would later ask if anything good could possibly come from such a place. Understanding Nazareth means understanding the radical nature of what Christians call the gospel. The good news did not descend from the centers of power. It emerged from the margins. It spoke first to the forgotten, the overlooked, the ones whose names appeared in no official records. The King of Kings grew up in a place that had no king, no palace, no army, no library, no theater, just limestone and labor and the slow turning of seasons. Walk through the archaeological remains today and you find the traces of ordinary life: cisterns carved into bedrock, olive presses, grain storage pits, cooking pots, oil lamps, the material culture of subsistence. These are the artifacts of Jesus' world. The background noise of the incarnation. Nazareth was home. More than that, Nazareth became identity. Jesus of Nazareth. The phrase appears again and again in the Gospels. Even his enemies used it. The sign above the cross would read, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. His followers became known as Nazarenes. The village name became inseparable from the movement that would transform the Roman Empire. This paradox demands our attention. The eternal God chose time and place. He chose first century Galilee. He chose a village so small that most people had never heard its name. The implications stretch in every direction. If the divine can dwell in Nazareth, then no place stands beyond the reach of sacred purpose. If the Messiah can emerge from obscurity, then no person remains too insignificant for God's attention. The story of Nazareth is the story of hidden things revealed. It is the story of the last becoming first. It is the story of a village that had no reason to matter except for one extraordinary fact: the Son of Man called it home. The silent centuries, Nazareth before Christ. Silence hangs over the Nazareth basin for most of recorded history. Dig through the archaeological layers and the evidence grows thin. The Late Bronze Age leaves almost no trace. The Iron Age offers scattered pottery fragments and little else. For centuries, this location sat at the edge of human activity in the region. The absence tells its own story. During the great events of ancient Near Eastern history, Nazareth simply did not exist as a significant settlement. When the armies of Egypt and Mesopotamia clashed, their paths ran elsewhere. When the kingdoms of the northern and southern tribes rose and fell, Nazareth remained outside the narrative. The Hebrew scriptures record hundreds of place names. Nazareth is not among them. This silence poses questions for those who study the historical Jesus. Some scholars in the 19th and 20th centuries questioned whether Nazareth existed at all in the first century. The argument ran like this: no pre-Christian source mentions it, therefore it must be a later invention. But archaeology has settled this debate. The village was there. It was simply too small and too unimportant to attract notice from historians and chroniclers. Excavations in the late 20th century revealed the earliest clear evidence of habitation. Agricultural installations carved into limestone bedrock date to the Hellenistic period, roughly the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era. These include wine presses, olive presses, and storage facilities. The settlers were farmers who worked the fertile soil of the basin and the terrace slopes above it. The population probably numbered between 200 and 400 people at most during this early period. Compare this to Sepphoris, the nearby regional capital, which housed perhaps 20,000 inhabitants at its height. Nazareth was a hamlet, a cluster of extended families who knew every face in the village. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business and privacy was a luxury no one enjoyed. The Jezreel Valley spreads out to the north of Nazareth. This broad plain served as a highway for armies throughout history. Egyptian forces marched through. Assyrian conquerors passed by. The valley witnessed battles that shaped empires. But the Nazareth Basin, protected by its hills and remote from the main routes, remained largely untouched by these conflicts. The settlers who eventually established Nazareth were Jewish. This becomes clear from the archaeological record. They built ritual baths called mikvaot. They used stone vessels for water storage, following purity laws. They avoided pig bones in their refuse heaps, observing dietary restrictions. These material traces point to a community deeply rooted in Jewish tradition and practice. The timing of Nazareth's emergence as a village coincides with broader patterns in Galilee. During the Hasmonean period, in the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era, Jewish settlement expanded throughout the region. Communities that had been abandoned or depopulated were rebuilt. New villages appeared. Nazareth was part of this wave of resettlement. The people who came to Nazareth likely descended from Judean families. They may have been refugees or migrants seeking land and opportunity in the north. Galilee offered space. The soil was good. Springs provided water. For families willing to work hard and carve out a life from limestone and clay, the region held promise. But why would anyone choose such a remote spot? The answer lies in agriculture. The Nazareth Basin, though small, contains excellent soil. Spring water emerges from the limestone. The surrounding hills can be terraced for olive trees and vineyards. For subsistence farmers, these factors mattered more than proximity to trade routes or urban centers. The village name itself may offer clues. Nazareth in Hebrew is Natzrat or Natzrat. Some scholars connect it to the Hebrew word netzer, meaning branch or shoot. Others suggest it derives from a root meaning to guard or watch. The etymology remains uncertain. What we know is that by the time of Jesus' birth, the name had become fixed to this particular place. Life in these early centuries would have been hard. Winters brought cold rain, summers baked the hillsides. Farming in the ancient world meant constant labor, plowing, planting, weeding, harvesting, threshing. The cycle never stopped. Beyond agriculture, the villagers needed craftsmen, someone to build houses, someone to repair tools, someone to weave cloth. The population remained stable and small for generations. There was population boom, no expansion beyond the narrow basin. Nazareth grew slowly, if at all. The village turned inward, focused on survival and the preservation of Jewish religious practice in a region increasingly influenced by Greek culture. Religious life centered on the synagogue, though no archaeological evidence of a first-century synagogue building has been found in Nazareth. This is not surprising. Early synagogues often met in homes or simple structures that left little trace. What mattered was not the building, but the gathering, the reading of Torah, the prayers, the maintenance of covenant identity in a world dominated by Rome. The Roman Empire cast its shadow over Galilee by the 1st century before the Common Era. Pompey conquered the region in 63 BCE. Herod the Great ruled as a client king, rebuilding Sepphoris after it was destroyed in revolt. His son Herod Antipas would later make Sepphoris even grander, transforming it into a showcase of Roman architecture and urban planning. But these great events barely touched Nazareth. The village paid its taxes. Its young men occasionally faced conscription for labor projects. Beyond that, the empire left it alone. There were no Roman soldiers stationed there, no Roman officials, no temples to Caesar, just Jewish farmers and craftsmen living as their ancestors had lived, waiting for the fulfillment of promises written in ancient scrolls. Into this obscurity, at the hinge point between the old age and the new, came the announcement that would change everything. The silent centuries were about to end. A closer look, the geographical and social setting of Galilee. Lower Galilee rises and falls in a rhythm of ridges and valleys. Limestone forms the bones of the land. Springs bubble up where the rock allows. The soil, when terraced and tended, yields grain, grapes, and olives. This is not the harsh wilderness of Judea to the south. Galilee is greener, more fertile, more forgiving to those who work it. Nazareth sits in a bowl-shaped valley, tucked between hills that provide shelter. To the northwest, Mount Precipice rises sharply. To the north, the land slopes toward the Jezreel Valley, that ancient corridor where armies have marched since time beyond memory. To the south and east, more hills. The village location offers protection. Raiders and soldiers tend to follow the easy paths. Nazareth was off the beaten track, but proximity to major routes mattered. The Via Maris, the way of the sea, ran through Galilee. This ancient trade route connected Egypt to Damascus and beyond. Caravans carried goods from Africa and the Mediterranean north to Mesopotamia and the eastern lands. Sepphoris, just an hour's walk from Nazareth, sat near enough to this route to benefit from trade. Nazareth was close enough to know what was happening in the wider world, but far enough to avoid much of the trouble that came with it. Water determined everything. The spring in Nazareth, known today as Mary's Well, provided the lifeblood of the community. Without it, the village could not exist. Women came daily to draw water. They carried it in jars balanced on their heads or shoulders. The spring became a gathering place. News spread there. Gossip circulated. Marriages were arranged. The spring was more than a water source. It was the village's social center. Galilee in the 1st century was a complex mix of cultures and peoples. Jewish communities dominated, but Greek influence was everywhere. Sepphoris, rebuilt by Herod Antipas, showcased Roman architecture. Greek was spoken in the markets alongside Aramaic. Gentile cities ringed the region. Ptolemais on the coast, Tyre and Sidon to the north. The Decapolis cities to the east. Jewish Galilee existed in constant contact with the non-Jewish world. This contact bred suspicion from Judeans in the south. The people of Jerusalem viewed Galileans as country cousins at best. At worst, they questioned their religious purity. Had they intermarried with Gentiles? Had they compromised their Jewish identity? The Galilean accent marked speakers as outsiders in Jerusalem. When Peter would later be identified as a follower of Jesus, his accent gave him away. The Judean prejudice had deep roots. Galilee had been separated from Judea for centuries. During the Assyrian conquest in the 8th century before the Common Era, the northern kingdom fell first. Foreign peoples were imported. The population mixed. When the Hasmoneans reconquered the region, they had to reconvert or reintegrate communities that had drifted from Orthodox practice. The memory of this history lingered. But Galilean Jews were fiercely devoted to their faith. They made pilgrimages to Jerusalem for the great festivals. They observed Torah. They circumcised their sons. They kept Sabbath. They maintained ritual purity. The archaeological evidence supports this. Galilean sites show consistent patterns of Jewish material culture. The accusation of laxness was more prejudice than reality. The economy of Galilee revolved around agriculture. The region could feed itself and produce surplus for export. Grain from the Jezreel Valley, olive oil pressed in countless village installations, wine from hillside vineyards, fish from the Sea of Galilee, salted and shipped throughout the empire. Galilee was rich compared to the rocky hills of Judea. This prosperity attracted attention. Rome taxed the land heavily. Herod Antipas, ruling as tetrarch, needed revenue to fund his building projects and maintain his position. The burden fell on farmers and craftsmen. They paid taxes to Rome through Herod. They paid the temple tax to support the priesthood in Jerusalem. They paid rent if they worked land owned by absentee landlords. The system squeezed them. Social tensions ran beneath the surface. The ruling class in Sepphoris lived in comfort. They built houses with mosaic floors. They attended theaters. They adopted Roman fashions. Meanwhile, farmers in villages like Nazareth struggled to keep enough of their harvest to feed their families. This disparity bred resentment. It created conditions for unrest. Galileans had a reputation for rebellion. Judas of Galilee led a revolt against Roman taxation in 6 CE, just as Jesus was growing up. The revolt was crushed, but the spirit of resistance lived on. Zealots and revolutionaries would emerge throughout the first century. The region had a streak of defiance that worried Roman governors. Into this world of tension between cultures, between rich and poor, between collaboration and resistance, Jesus was born. Nazareth itself stood somewhat apart from the most intense pressures. It was too small to attract much notice. But the forces shaping Galilee shaped Nazareth too. The taxes still had to be paid. The Roman soldiers still patrolled the region. The great world pressed in on the small village, whether its residents wanted it to or not. The geography isolated Nazareth just enough. The social setting of Galilee embedded it in the larger conflicts of the age. This combination would prove significant. Jesus grew up knowing the quiet rhythms of village life while also being aware of the great forces of empire and revolution swirling around him. He was provincial, but not ignorant. He was from the margins, but not cut off from the center. The land itself shaped faith. The farmers of Galilee knew dependence. Rain had to come at the right time. Springs had to flow. Crops had to ripen. Disaster was always one drought or one tax increase away. This dependence bred a particular kind of piety. Trust in God was not abstract theology. It was the difference between eating and starving. The Galilean landscape appears again and again in Jesus' teaching. Seeds and soils, lilies of the field, birds of the air, shepherds and sheep, grain and harvest. His parables are rooted in this place. The geography of Galilee became the geography of the kingdom of God in his words. The familiar made strange, the ordinary revealed as sacred. The Annunciation, the moment Nazareth entered history. The Gospel of Luke places the moment precisely. In the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, God sent the angel Gabriel to a town in Galilee called Nazareth. The geography matters to Luke. He names the region, he names the town, he grounds the cosmic event in a specific location that most of his readers would never have heard of. Gabriel came to a virgin pledged to be married to a man named Joseph. Her name was Mary. The angel entered her presence and spoke words that would echo through history. Greetings, you who are highly favored. The Lord is with you. Mary was troubled. Luke tells us this plainly. The appearance of an angel was not a comfortable experience. Gabriel had to tell her not to be afraid. Then came the message. She would conceive and give birth to a son. She was to name him Jesus. He would be great and would be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God would give him the throne of his father David. He would reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom would never end. The promise contained layers of meaning that any Jewish listener would recognize. The throne of David pointed back to the great king and forward to the messianic hope. The eternal kingdom echoed prophecies that sustained the Jewish people through centuries of exile and oppression. The Son who would save his people from their sins carried the weight of every failed rebellion, every crushed hope, every prayer for deliverance. Mary asked the obvious question, how could this happen when she was a virgin? Gabriel explained that the Holy Spirit would come upon her. The power of the Most High would overshadow her. Therefore, the Holy One to be born would be called the Son of God. As proof, Gabriel pointed to Elizabeth, Mary's relative, who was pregnant in her old age despite being barren. Nothing was impossible with God. Mary's response has been analyzed by theologians for 2,000 years. I am the Lord's servant. May your word to me be fulfilled. In that moment of consent, the incarnation became possible. The eternal word prepared to enter time. The Creator prepared to become creature. All of this began in a small house in Nazareth. The theological significance is immense, but the geographical significance deserves equal attention. God could have chosen Jerusalem, the holy city where the temple stood. He could have chosen Bethlehem, the city of David. He could have chosen Sepphoris, the grand capital nearby. Instead, the announcement came to Nazareth. This choice reveals something essential about the nature of God's action in the world. The gospel does not begin at the center. It begins at the margins. It does not announce itself to the powerful. It comes to the powerless. A peasant girl in a forgotten village receives news that will shake empires. Luke structures his narrative to emphasize the contrast. Just before the Annunciation to Mary, he recounts the announcement to Zechariah in the temple. Zechariah was a priest performing sacred duties in the holy place. Gabriel appeared to him there in the heart of Jewish religious life, but Zechariah doubted and was struck silent. Then the scene shifts, from the temple to a house, from a priest to a peasant girl, from the center of religious authority to the periphery of the known world. Mary believed where Zechariah doubted. The unlikely became the chosen. The location of the Annunciation also transforms Nazareth itself. Before this moment, the town was nothing, a place that left no mark on history. After this moment, Nazareth becomes the hometown of the Messiah. Its name becomes inseparable from the identity of Jesus. Every time someone says Jesus of Nazareth, they invoke this event and this place. The house where the Annunciation occurred became an object of veneration in later centuries. Byzantine Christians built a church over the traditional site. Crusaders rebuilt it. Modern pilgrims visit the Church of the Annunciation in Nazareth today. The exact location may be debated, but the significance of the place cannot be. Mary would soon leave Nazareth to visit Elizabeth in the hill country of Judea. The Magnificat, her great song of praise, would be sung in Elizabeth's house, not in Nazareth, but she would return. Nazareth was home. This was where she would raise the child. This was where Jesus would grow from infant to boy to man. The Annunciation marks the hinge of salvation history. Everything before it was preparation. Everything after it flows from it. And it happened in Nazareth. The most significant moment in Christian theology occurred in a place so small it appears on no maps from the period. This pattern would repeat throughout Jesus' ministry. He ate with tax collectors and sinners. He touched lepers. He healed on the Sabbath. He welcomed children. He praised the faith of a Roman centurion and a Canaanite woman. He told his disciples that the last would be first and the first last. The geography of the Annunciation prefigures the entire ministry. God's purposes run counter to human expectations. The angel departed. Mary pondered these things in her heart. Life in Nazareth continued. The spring still flowed. Farmers still worked their fields. Craftsmen still built and repaired. But everything had changed. The Word was becoming flesh. The light was preparing to enter the darkness. And Nazareth, insignificant Nazareth, stood at the center of the greatest event in human history. The hidden years, daily life in a first century Nazareth home. The typical house in Nazareth would have been small and simple. Limestone blocks formed the walls, quarried from the abundant local stone. The floor was packed earth, sometimes plastered. A single room served multiple purposes: cooking, sleeping, working, living. Privacy, as we understand it, did not exist. Many houses were built into or against the hillside, using the natural rock as one wall. This provided insulation against summer heat and winter cold. The roof consisted of wooden beams covered with branches, reeds, and packed mud. It had to be maintained regularly or it would leak when the rains came. Stairs on the outside led to the roof, which served as extra living space in good weather. Inside, furnishings were minimal. Stone benches ran along walls, sleeping mats rolled out at night. Clay jars held grain, oil, and water. A cooking hearth sat in one corner or outside in a courtyard. Metal tools were expensive and precious. Most implements were stone or wood. Lighting came from small oil lamps that gave off a dim, flickering glow. The courtyard was the heart of daily life. Extended families often shared a courtyard complex. Several small rooms opened onto a common space where much of the work happened. Women ground grain here, using hand mills, circular stones that required hours of labor each day. They baked bread in small clay ovens. They prepared food. They spun thread and wove cloth. The diet was simple but adequate when harvests were good. Bread formed the foundation of every meal. Barley bread for the poor, wheat bread for those who could afford it. Olive oil provided fat and flavor. Lentils, beans, and chickpeas offered protein. Onions, leeks, and garlic added taste. Figs and dates supplied sweetness. Fish, dried or salted, came from the Sea of Galilee. Meat was rare, reserved for special occasions and festivals. Water came from the village spring. Women walked there daily, often multiple times, carrying large jars. This was hard labor. A full water jar could weigh 30 pounds or more. But it was also social time. The women talked. They shared news. They arranged marriages for their children. The spring was where the life of the village was negotiated and maintained. Clothing was equally simple. Men wore a tunic, a single piece of fabric with holes for the head and arms. Over this, a cloak for warmth. Sandals protected feet. A head covering shielded against sun. The fabrics were wool or linen, undyed or naturally colored. Only the wealthy could afford the purple and scarlet dyes that signaled status. Women wore similar tunics, often longer. They covered their heads in public. Jewelry was rare and precious. A woman might own a few coins strung together as a headpiece or necklace. To lose one of these coins, as in Jesus' later parable, was a genuine crisis. Children worked from a young age. Boys helped their fathers. Girls helped their mothers. By age 6 or 7, a child was expected to contribute to the household economy. Play happened, but it fit around work. Education for boys began at the synagogue, where they learned to read Torah. Girls were taught domestic skills at home. The rhythm of life followed the sun and the seasons. People rose at dawn, work filled the daylight hours, evening brought rest. The Sabbath interrupted this pattern weekly. On the seventh day, work stopped. Families gathered, they walked to the synagogue, they prayed, they rested. This rhythm shaped time itself. The agricultural calendar dominated the year. Plowing and planting in autumn after the first rains, growth through winter, harvest in late spring and early summer. The grape harvest came in late summer, olive harvest in autumn. Between these major events, constant maintenance, weeding, pruning, repairing terraces, tending animals. Festivals punctuated the year. Passover in spring, commemorating the exodus from Egypt. Weeks, or Pentecost, 50 days later, celebrating the grain harvest. Tabernacles in autumn, recalling the wilderness wandering. These festivals required pilgrimage to Jerusalem when possible. For a family in Nazareth, the journey took several days on foot. Extended family formed the basic social unit. A household might include grandparents, parents, children, and unmarried siblings. Marriages were arranged. Girls married young, often in their mid-teens. Boys married later when they could support a family. Marriage was not primarily about romance. It was about alliance, survival, and the continuation of the family line. Honor and shame governed social relations. A family's reputation had to be guarded carefully. Women's behavior reflected on the entire household. Any hint of sexual impropriety brought shame on everyone. Men had to demonstrate strength and reliability. Failure to provide or protect meant loss of honor. In this world, a pregnancy outside marriage was catastrophic. Mary's condition would have been obvious within months. The village was too small to hide anything. Joseph's decision to take her as his wife despite the circumstances went against every social norm. It required either divine revelation or love that transcended honor, or both. Jesus grew up in this environment. He learned to walk on packed earth floors and limestone paths. He ate barley bread and lentils. He watched his mother draw water and grind grain. He learned his father's trade. He observed the Sabbath. He heard Torah read and explained in the synagogue. He made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The mundane details matter. The incarnation was not abstract. God did not merely appear human. He lived a human life in all its concrete particularity. He knew hunger, he knew exhaustion, he knew the ache of muscles after a long day's work. He knew the taste of his mother's cooking. He knew the smell of olive oil, lamps, and wood smoke and sweat. This was the hidden life. Luke tells us only that Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and people. The years between infancy and ministry remain largely unknown, but we can reconstruct the context. We know what life was like in a village like Nazareth. We know the rhythms and routines. Jesus lived them. The hidden years were formative. The carpenter's son from Nazareth learned the scriptures. He learned to pray. He learned to work with his hands. He learned what it meant to be human in a specific time and place. When he began to teach, his words would be rooted in this experience. The parables would reflect this world. The kingdom of God would be described in the language of Galilean farmers and craftsmen. Nothing in Nazareth was wasted. Even the obscurity served a purpose. The Messiah did not arrive with fanfare and credentials. He arrived as a baby in a working-class family in a village no one had heard of. He grew up like any other Jewish boy in Galilee. This was the scandal and the glory of the incarnation. God became truly human. He lived a truly human life, and he did it in Nazareth. The Nazareth economy: carpentry, agriculture, and survival. The economy of Nazareth rested on two foundations: agriculture and craft work. Most families worked the land. A smaller number practiced trades that supported the community. Together, these activities created a subsistence economy where survival depended on the labor of every member of the household. The agricultural work followed the ancient pattern of Mediterranean farming. The Nazareth Basin and surrounding hillsides provided enough arable land for the small population. Families owned or rented small plots. They grew barley and wheat in the flat areas. They terraced the slopes for vines and olive trees. Every bit of usable land was cultivated. The olive tree dominated the agricultural landscape. Olive oil served multiple purposes. It provided calories and fat in the diet. It fueled lamps. It was used for cooking and for ritual anointing. The trees themselves were valuable assets passed down through generations. An established olive grove meant stability and relative prosperity. Pressing olives required specialized equipment. Large stone presses carved into bedrock still mark ancient Nazareth. The process was labor-intensive. The olives were crushed. The pulp was placed in woven baskets. Weight was applied to extract the oil. The first pressing yielded the finest oil. Subsequent pressings produced lower grades. Nothing was wasted. Grapes grew on terraced hillsides. The vintage came in late summer. Families picked the clusters and carried them to wine presses, also carved from stone. Feet trampled the grapes. The juice flowed into collection vats. Fermentation began almost immediately. Wine was safer to drink than water in many cases and provided calories as well. Grain required different work. Plowing broke the hard ground. This was done with a wooden plow, often just a forked branch with an iron tip, pulled by an ox or donkey. The farmer walked behind, guiding the plow. Planting followed the plow. The grain grew through winter. Harvest came in late spring. Harvesting was communal work. Everyone who could hold a sickle helped. The cut grain was bundled into sheaves. These were carried to the threshing floor, a flat area of hard-packed earth or stone. Oxen trampled the grain or pulled a threshing sledge over it. This separated the kernels from the stalks. Then came winnowing. Workers tossed the mixture into the air with wooden forks. The wind carried away the chaff. The heavier grain fell back to the floor. The grain was stored in pits carved into limestone or in large pottery jars. It had to last until the next harvest. Careful rationing was essential. A failed harvest meant hunger. 2 failed harvests meant famine. Beyond farming, Nazareth needed craftsmen. Someone had to build houses. Someone had to make and repair tools. Someone had to weave cloth. The village was too small to support many specialized trades, but certain skills were essential. Joseph was a tekton. This Greek word appears in the Gospels to describe his occupation. Traditional translations render it as carpenter, but tekton means more than woodworker. It refers to a builder, a craftsman who worked with multiple materials, wood certainly, but also stone. A tekton built houses. He repaired roofs, he made doors and window frames, he constructed agricultural installations, he fashioned yokes for oxen and plows for fields. The tekton's trade required skill and strength. The work was physical, lifting heavy timbers, shaping stone, wielding iron tools. The hands of a tekton bore calluses and scars. Jesus learned this trade from Joseph. When he later taught in the synagogue at Nazareth, the people asked, "Isn't this the tekton?" They knew him as a working man. The materials for this work came from the surrounding area. Limestone was abundant. Timber was more scarce. Trees suitable for building had to be purchased or cut from managed groves. Good wood was expensive. This shaped how buildings were constructed. Stone bore the weight. Wood was used sparingly for roofs and doors. The tools of a tekton were precious. Adzes for shaping wood, chisels for stone, mallets, saws, a plumb line for ensuring walls were straight. These tools represented significant investment. They were maintained carefully and passed from father to son. The economic relationship between craftsmen and farmers was symbiotic. Farmers needed buildings and tools. They paid the tekton in grain, oil, or wine. Sometimes they paid in labor, helping with a building project in exchange for the craftsman's skills. Cash money existed but was not the primary medium of exchange in a village economy. Nazareth's proximity to Sepphoris created opportunity. When Herod Antipas rebuilt and expanded Sepphoris in the early 1st century, enormous amounts of construction work became available. It is entirely plausible that Joseph and Jesus walked the short distance to Sepphoris to work on these projects. The pay would have been better than what could be earned in the village. The exposure to urban life and Greco-Roman culture would have been significant. But this work also had a cost. Sepphoris represented the collaboration between the Jewish elite and Roman power. Working there meant participating in a system that oppressed the people through taxation and cultural pressure. Some Galileans refused such work on principle. Others needed the income to survive. The economic pressure on Galilean villagers was real and constant. Rome demanded taxes. These were collected by publicans, local agents who often added their own fees. Herod Antipas needed revenue for his building projects and his own lifestyle. The temple in Jerusalem expected its due. All of this came out of the surplus produced by farmers and craftsmen. When the surplus was small or non-existent, the pressure became crushing. Families could fall into debt. Land could be lost. The cycle of poverty was hard to break. This economic reality shaped Jesus' later teaching. He spoke often about debt and forgiveness. He told parables about workers in vineyards, about tenants and landowners, about the danger of wealth. These were not abstract lessons. They reflected the lived experience of people in villages like Nazareth. The kingdom of God that Jesus proclaimed had economic implications. When he spoke of the last being first, he addressed a real social order where the poor struggled under the weight of taxes and debt. When he said, "You cannot serve both God and money," he spoke to people who understood the crushing power of economic forces. The subsistence economy of Nazareth was precarious. Good harvests brought enough. Bad harvests brought hunger. The margin between survival and disaster was thin. This precarity bred both anxiety and faith. Anxiety about having enough. Faith in God's provision. Jesus would later tell his followers not to worry about what they would eat or wear. He spoke as one who had lived in a world where such worry was constant and rational. The work itself had dignity. Paul would later write that those who do not work should not eat. This was not harsh morality, but economic reality in communities like Nazareth. Everyone who could work had to work. There was no surplus to support the idle. Labor was honorable because labor was necessary. Jesus worked with his hands for most of his life. The years of public ministry were brief compared to the years of labor in Nazareth. He knew the satisfaction of a well-made door frame. He knew the frustration of wood that split wrong. He knew the exhaustion at the end of a long day. When he called disciples away from their nets and their tax booths, he called them away from the same kind of work he had done. The economy of Nazareth was the economy of ordinary people trying to survive in a world that extracted more than it gave back. It was the economy of subsistence, where labor and land and community held life together. Understanding this economy helps us understand the man who grew up within it and the message he would eventually proclaim. The boy Jesus in Nazareth, education, faith, and a foreshadowing. A Jewish boy in Nazareth began his education early. The foundation was Torah. The law given to Moses formed the core of identity for the Jewish people. To know Torah was to know who you were and whose you were. Education was not optional. It was essential to maintaining covenant faithfulness. The primary teacher was the Father. Joseph would have taught Jesus the prayers that marked the day. The Shema recited morning and evening, declaring the Lord alone as God, the blessings over food and wine, the Psalms. These prayers shaped the rhythm of life. They connected the mundane to the sacred. As Jesus grew old enough, he would have attended the synagogue school. The synagogue in Nazareth served as both gathering place for Sabbath worship and school during the week. The Hazan, the synagogue attendant, often served as teacher. Boys learned to read Hebrew, the sacred language of Scripture, even though they spoke Aramaic at home. The method was memorization. The boys recited texts until they were written on their hearts. They began with the Torah, the first 5 books, then the prophets, then the writings. The Jewish scriptures became part of their mental furniture. Phrases and verses were always ready, available for meditation and application. Jesus learned well. This becomes clear from the gospel accounts of his ministry. He quoted scripture constantly. He interpreted it with authority. He debated with scribes and Pharisees who had spent their entire lives studying Torah. His knowledge was deep and his understanding profound. This foundation was laid in Nazareth. The education was not merely intellectual, it was formational. The goal was not simply to know what Torah said, but to live according to its commands. The boys learned how to observe Sabbath, how to maintain purity, how to offer prayers, how to treat neighbors. The law was meant to be lived. The synagogue also shaped corporate identity. On Sabbath, the community gathered. The scrolls were brought out, passages were read. They were translated from Hebrew into Aramaic for those who did not understand the sacred tongue. They were interpreted and applied. Questions were discussed. The congregation participated in the process of understanding what God required. Jesus would have attended these gatherings from childhood. He heard the prophets read and explained. He heard the promises of a coming deliverer. He heard the laments over exile and oppression. He heard the calls to justice and mercy. The prophetic tradition saturated his consciousness. Beyond the formal education, Jesus learned from daily life. The parables he would later tell drew on what he observed. Farmers scattering seed, women kneading dough, shepherds searching for lost sheep, children playing in the marketplace. These images came from Nazareth. The ordinary became the vocabulary for speaking about the kingdom of God. The religious calendar shaped the year. The festivals were not just commemorations. They were participatory remembrances. At Passover, families retold the story of the Exodus as if they themselves had been freed from Egypt. At Tabernacles, they lived in temporary shelters to recall the wilderness wandering. The past became present. The story became their story. Luke records one event from Jesus' childhood that breaks the silence of the hidden years. When Jesus was 12 years old, his family traveled to Jerusalem for Passover. This was likely not his first pilgrimage, but it was significant. At 12, a Jewish boy was approaching adulthood. Soon he would be responsible for keeping the law himself. The family made the journey with others from Nazareth. The pilgrimage was communal. They walked for days, covering the roughly 80 miles from Galilee to Jerusalem. As they walked, they sang the Psalms of Ascent. These were the songs pilgrims had sung for centuries. The journey was as much about anticipation as arrival. Jerusalem during Passover was crowded. Pilgrims from throughout Judea, Galilee, and the diaspora packed the city. The temple dominated the skyline. The courts bustled with activity. Sacrifices were offered. Prayers were lifted. The presence of God felt close in that place. After the festival, Mary and Joseph began the journey home. They assumed Jesus was somewhere in the group of travelers. A day's journey out, they realized he was not with them. Panic set in. They returned to Jerusalem. For 3 days they searched. Finally, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening and asking questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. This detail matters. Jesus was not merely listening, he was engaging. He was already demonstrating the wisdom that would characterize his ministry. The boy from Nazareth held his own with the learned men of Jerusalem. Mary's response was natural. "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." Jesus' answer revealed something profound about his self-understanding. "Why were you searching for me? Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" The distinction was clear. Joseph was not his father in the ultimate sense. God was. The house in Nazareth was not his true home. The temple, the dwelling place of God's presence, was where he belonged. At 12 years old, Jesus already understood his unique relationship to God. Luke adds that Mary and Joseph did not understand what he meant. This is telling. Even those closest to him, even his mother who had received the angelic announcement, could not fully grasp who he was. The mystery would unfold slowly. Jesus returned with them to Nazareth. Luke says he was obedient to them. The remarkable child submitted to ordinary parental authority. He went back to the rhythms of village life. The learning continued. The carpentry work continued. The Sabbath observances continued. But something had been revealed, a glimpse of the extraordinary hidden within the ordinary. Luke summarizes the years that followed with a single sentence. Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and people. He matured physically, intellectually, socially, and spiritually. The development was holistic. The incarnation meant experiencing human growth in all its dimensions. The education Jesus received in Nazareth equipped him for his mission, the deep knowledge of Scripture, the understanding of Jewish faith and practice, the experience of ordinary life among ordinary people, the awareness of his unique identity as God's Son. All of these elements were woven together in the hidden years. When Jesus finally emerged from Nazareth to begin his public ministry, he was fully prepared. The preparation happened in obscurity. The teacher was shaped in silence. The prophet was formed in a forgotten village. Nothing was accidental. Everything was providential. Nazareth was the school where the Messiah learned what it meant to be human. The launching pad, Jesus' baptism and temptation from a Nazarene perspective. The young man who walked the dusty road from Nazareth to the Jordan River carried 30 years of that village with him. Every lesson learned in Joseph's workshop, every Sabbath in the synagogue, every prayer whispered under the Galilean stars. The hidden years were about to give way to public ministry, but Nazareth remained woven into the fabric of who he was. The Gospel of Mark opens with striking abruptness. No birth story, no childhood tales, just a simple statement. Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee to be baptized by John. This detail matters more than it first appears. Mark chooses to identify Jesus not by his lineage or his miraculous birth, but by his hometown, the Nazarene, the man from that place. At the Jordan, Jesus joined crowds of penitent Jews seeking ritual cleansing, farmers and fishermen, tax collectors and soldiers, all confessing their failures and hoping for renewal. The ritual itself would have been familiar to someone raised in a devout Jewish home. Mikvahs, or ritual baths, were common in first-century Jewish life. Archaeological excavations throughout Galilee have uncovered numerous examples of these stepped pools used for ceremonial washing. But something different happened when Jesus entered those waters. The heavens tore open. The Spirit descended like a dove. A voice spoke words that would define everything that followed. "You are my beloved Son. With you I am well pleased." These words carried weight that echoed through the Torah. They combined phrases from Psalm 2, a royal coronation psalm, and Isaiah 42, the first servant song. The carpenter from Nazareth was being declared both king and suffering servant, both roles that would have seemed impossible for someone from such humble origins. The Spirit that descended on Jesus immediately drove him into the wilderness, not a gentle leading. The Greek word is ekbalo, which means to cast out or expel with force, the same word used for driving out demons. After 30 years of quiet preparation in Nazareth, the mission began not with triumph, but with testing. For 40 days, Jesus fasted in the barren places east of the Jordan. The number itself resonated with Jewish memory. 40 years wandering in the wilderness, 40 days Moses spent on Mount Sinai, 40 days Elijah traveled to Mount Horeb. Each period was a time of testing, refinement, and encounter with God. The temptations that came focused on identity and method. Satan's strategy was subtle. He didn't question whether Jesus was the Son of God. He questioned what that meant and how it should be lived out. If you are the Son of God, turn stones to bread. If you are the Son of God, throw yourself from the temple. The underlying question was always the same. Will you trust the Father's way or take shortcuts to glory? Each temptation offered a plausible alternative to the path of suffering. Provide for physical needs through miracle. Prove divine favor through spectacle. Gain worldly power through compromise. These weren't absurd suggestions. They were reasonable paths that any Messiah might consider. Jesus answered each temptation with scripture, specifically with passages from Deuteronomy 6-8, texts that describe the testing of the Hebrew people in their wilderness wandering. Where they failed, Jesus succeeded. Where they grumbled and doubted, Jesus trusted. The parallel was deliberate. The Son was reliving the story of the sons, but writing a different ending. The setting of these temptations matters. The wilderness of Judea is a harsh, unforgiving landscape. Rocky terrain carved by ancient water into deep wadis, temperatures that swing from baking heat to bitter cold, a place where survival demands constant vigilance. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, described this region as virtually uninhabited, a refuge for outlaws and hermits. When the testing ended, angels came and ministered to Jesus. The Greek word used here, diakoneo, means to serve or attend to needs. The same word later used to describe women who supported Jesus' ministry. The same word Jesus would use to describe his own mission. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. The significance of this sequence becomes clearer when we consider what Jesus returned to after the wilderness. He didn't go back to Nazareth immediately. Instead, he began gathering disciples and teaching in Galilean synagogues. Word of his wisdom and authority spread rapidly through the network of small villages dotting the region. Archaeological surveys of first-century Galilee reveal a dense population of small agricultural communities, most with populations under 500 people. News traveled quickly in such settings. A teacher performing signs and speaking with unusual authority would have been the talk of every market and well. But the question that would follow Jesus throughout his ministry had already been planted. Could the Messiah really come from Nazareth? Could the Son of God emerge from such an unremarkable place? The wilderness testing answered that question with resounding clarity. Divine calling doesn't depend on impressive origins. It depends on faithful obedience. The contrast between Jesus' humble origins and his cosmic mission was no accident. It was central to the message. God's kingdom doesn't come with the pomp and circumstance that humans expect. It comes quietly in backwater villages, through carpenters' sons who trust the Father, even when that trust leads through wilderness and testing. Everything Jesus faced in those 40 days would reappear throughout his ministry. The temptation to prove himself through spectacle, the pressure to provide material solutions to spiritual problems, the offer of power without the path of suffering. Each time he would choose the harder way, the way that led through rejection, misunderstanding, and ultimately a criminal's death. The baptism and temptation weren't just personal experiences for Jesus. They were his commissioning as the true representative of God's people. Where Adam failed in a garden, Jesus succeeded in a wilderness. Where the Hebrews complained after leaving Egypt, Jesus trusted after leaving Nazareth. The second Adam was proving faithful where the first had fallen. For the people of Nazareth, watching one of their own rise to prominence must have stirred complex emotions. Pride, certainly, but also confusion and perhaps skepticism. They had known him as a child. They had seen him work alongside Joseph. How could this familiar figure now claim divine authority? That tension would soon reach a breaking point when Jesus returned to teach in his hometown synagogue. The launching pad was about to become a battlefield. Rejection in the hometown. The synagogue showdown. The day Jesus returned to teach in Nazareth synagogue should have been a celebration. Local boy makes good. The carpenter's son, who had become a renowned teacher throughout Galilee, was coming home. Instead, it became one of the most violent rejections recorded in the Gospels. Luke's Gospel preserves the most detailed account of this encounter. Jesus entered the synagogue on the Sabbath, as was his custom. The phrase matters because it shows continuity. Even as an itinerant teacher, Jesus maintained the rhythms of Jewish worship that had shaped him since childhood. The synagogue wasn't just a building, it was the beating heart of Jewish community life in villages like Nazareth. Archaeological remains of first-century Galilean synagogues suggest modest structures, has often repurposed buildings or simple rectangular rooms with stone benches along the walls. The Nazareth synagogue would have been intimate, holding perhaps 50 to 100 people at most. Everyone present would have known Jesus personally. They had watched him grow up. The scroll handed to Jesus that day contained the prophet Isaiah. Whether this was the scheduled reading or a deliberate choice remains unclear from Luke's account. What matters is what Jesus chose to read. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. The passage continues with promises of release for captives, sight for the blind, freedom for the oppressed. These words from Isaiah 61 had long been understood as messianic prophecy. They described the coming age when God would restore his people and establish justice. Every Jew listening would have recognized the weight of these promises. Jesus rolled up the scroll, handed it back to the attendant, and sat down. All eyes fixed on him. The posture was significant. Teachers sat when delivering authoritative instruction. Students and listeners stood or sat on the ground. By sitting, Jesus was claiming the role of interpreter, of one who possessed authority to explain the text. What he said next detonated like a bomb in that small room. Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. Not tomorrow, not someday in the distant future. Today, right here, in this moment, in this unremarkable village synagogue, through this carpenter's son. The claim was staggering in its audacity. At first, the crowd responded positively. Luke says they spoke well of him and marveled at the gracious words coming from his mouth. But beneath the initial wonder lurked a troubling question. Is not this Joseph's son? The question reveals the core of their struggle. They knew his family. They knew his occupation. They remembered him as a child playing in Nazareth's dusty streets. How could someone so familiar, so ordinary, claim to fulfill ancient prophecy? The sociological tension was razor sharp. Small communities operate on shared memory and established social hierarchies. Someone stepping out of their assigned role threatens the entire social order. Jesus perceived their skepticism before they voiced it. He knew what they were thinking. Physician, heal yourself. The proverb meant something like, prove yourself here first. They had heard reports of miracles in Capernaum and other Galilean towns. If Jesus truly possessed divine power, why not demonstrate it in his own hometown? Why should strangers receive signs while his own people went without? But Jesus refused to play by their rules. Instead, he pointed to uncomfortable biblical precedents. In Elijah's day, many widows lived in the northern kingdom during a devastating famine. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them, only to a foreign widow in Zarephath. In Elisha's time, many lepers suffered in the land, yet only Naaman the Syrian was cleansed. The message was unmistakable. God's grace often flows beyond expected boundaries. Divine favor doesn't automatically fall on those who assume they deserve it based on ethnicity or proximity. The prophets themselves had ministered to outsiders while their own people remained unblessed. This was too much. What began as wonder curdled into rage. The entire synagogue erupted. They seized Jesus and drove him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built. The intent was clear. They meant to throw him down the cliff. The geography here matters. Nazareth sits in a basin surrounded by hills. Several locations around the town feature steep drops that could fit Luke's description. Archaeological surveys suggest the most likely site is a limestone escarpment on the southeastern edge of the ancient village, where the drop reaches 30 to 40 meters. What happened next remains mysterious. Luke simply says Jesus passed through their midst and went away. Some have suggested the crowd's fury dissipated. Others propose divine intervention, perhaps making Jesus unrecognizable or creating confusion. The text doesn't explain. It merely records that the one they tried to destroy walked away unharmed. The rejection in Nazareth wasn't random violence. It was rooted in specific cultural and psychological factors. Honor and shame governed Mediterranean society in the first century. A person's worth was determined largely by public perception. For someone to claim extraordinary status without the corresponding credentials or demonstrations of power was seen as shameful presumption. Jesus had violated these unwritten rules. He claimed prophetic authority without proving himself first to those who knew him best. He suggested that outsiders might receive God's blessing while insiders remained in need. He challenged their assumptions about how divine favor operates. There's also the phenomenon that sociologists call the prophet's paradox. Familiarity breeds contempt, especially when someone from within the community claims special status. The very intimacy that should have given Jesus credibility became the obstacle to belief. They couldn't reconcile the extraordinary claims with the ordinary person they thought they knew. Mark's parallel account adds a poignant detail. A prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and among his relatives and in his own household. The rejection went beyond the general community. It included family. Those who should have been his strongest supporters struggled most to accept his mission. This event marked a turning point. Jesus would continue teaching throughout Galilee, but Nazareth fades from the gospel narratives after this. The village that shaped him became the village that rejected him. The launching pad became a closed door. Yet, even in rejection, there was purpose. The Nazareth confrontation revealed the pattern that would define Jesus' entire ministry. The expected would refuse him. The outsiders would receive him. The first would become last. The last would become first. The kingdom of God operated by a different logic than human kingdoms. The scars of that rejection likely lingered for both Jesus and the community. Small villages have long memories. The day they tried to throw the carpenter's son off a cliff would have been told and retold, becoming part of Nazareth's story. Some probably felt justified. Others perhaps nursed quiet regret. What's certain is that Nazareth's rejection of Jesus became emblematic of a larger truth. Divine revelation often comes in packages we don't expect, from places we don't value, through people we think we already know. The challenge is whether we can see past our assumptions to recognize God at work in surprising ways. The boy from Nazareth had come home, and home had sent him away. Can anything good come from Nazareth? The town's reputation. The question hangs in the air like smoke. Nathanael asked it when Philip told him they had found the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. The response was immediate, almost reflexive. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? This single line, preserved in John's Gospel, reveals volumes about how first-century people perceived this tiny Galilean village. The question wasn't asked in curiosity, it was asked in dismissal. The very idea that someone from Nazareth could be the promised deliverer seemed absurd. But what made Nazareth such an object of scorn? Why did its name become shorthand for insignificance? Geography provides the first clue. Nazareth sat tucked in a valley in Lower Galilee, removed from major routes and population centers. Unlike Sepphoris, the gleaming capital just an hour's walk north, or Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee's shore, Nazareth offered nothing of political, economic, or strategic value. It wasn't mentioned in the Hebrew scriptures. It didn't appear in Josephus's extensive catalogs of Galilean settlements. For most of the ancient world, it simply didn't exist. Population estimates for first-century Nazareth range from 100 to 400 people. Archaeological surveys of the area reveal a cluster of small homes carved into the limestone hillsides, surrounded by agricultural terraces. The village survived through subsistence farming and small-scale craftwork. Nothing more, nothing impressive. Compare this to cities mentioned with pride in Jewish tradition. Jerusalem, the holy city, location of the temple, center of Jewish worship. Bethlehem, though small, claimed fame as David's birthplace. Hebron housed the tombs of the patriarchs. These places carried weight in Jewish consciousness. Nazareth carried none. The broader Galilean context complicated matters further. Galilee itself faced suspicion from Judeans in the south. The region had been separated from Judea for centuries, developing its own dialect and customs. When Galilee was forcibly incorporated into the Jewish state under the Hasmonean dynasty in the late 2nd century BC, the reunion was political more than cultural. Judeans considered Galileans rustic at best, suspect at worst. The Talmud preserves sayings that mock Galilean speech patterns and religious laxity. The accusation that Galileans couldn't distinguish between certain guttural sounds in Hebrew appears multiple times in rabbinic literature. This linguistic difference would later betray Peter in the high priest's courtyard, when his accent marked him as a follower of the Galilean. Galilee's mixed population added to southern suspicions. Gentile cities dotted the landscape. Greek culture had penetrated deeply, especially in urban centers. The degree of Jewish observance varied widely across the region. For strict Judeans, this heterogeneity bred contamination. True faith required separation, and Galileans were too willing to mingle. Within Galilee itself, hierarchies existed. Sepphoris and Tiberias were cosmopolitan centers with paved streets, public buildings, and administrative importance. Towns like Capernaum and Chorazin sat on vital trade routes, benefiting from commercial traffic. Nazareth enjoyed none of these advantages. Even among the overlooked, it was the most overlooked. The name itself offers no help. Unlike many biblical place names with clear meanings, Nazareth resists easy explanation. Some scholars suggest it derives from a Hebrew root meaning branch or shoot, which would create a fascinating connection to messianic prophecies about a branch from Jesse's root. Others propose connections to words meaning watch or guard. The uncertainty surrounding even the name's origin mirrors the town's obscurity. Nathanael's question takes on sharper meaning in this context. He wasn't just expressing geographical prejudice, he was voicing the conventional wisdom of his era. Messiahs don't come from nowhere. They emerge from places that matter, carrying the weight of sacred history. Nazareth had no such weight. It was, in every measurable way, insignificant. The New Testament writers were clearly aware of this problem. Matthew's gospel works to connect Jesus to Bethlehem, the city of David. Luke does the same, carefully explaining how a Nazarene could claim Davidic descent. John opens with a cosmic prologue that establishes Jesus' divine origin before mentioning his earthly hometown. The writers knew they faced a credibility challenge. Roman sources from the period ignore Nazareth entirely. The town was too small, too poor, too removed from events that mattered to imperial chroniclers. Even when Christianity began spreading through the empire in later decades, Nazareth itself remained insignificant. Pilgrims sought Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and eventually sites around the Sea of Galilee. Nazareth would wait centuries before becoming a destination. This obscurity created problems for early Christian apologists. Critics like Celsus in the 2nd century mocked Jesus' origins. How could someone from a backwater village claim universal authority? The accusation stung because it touched truth. By every conventional measure of importance, Nazareth offered nothing to commend it. Yet the gospel writers never tried to deny or minimize this reality. They leaned into it. John's narrative has Philip respond to Nathanael's skepticism, not with arguments, but with an invitation. Come and see. The proof wouldn't be found in Nazareth's pedigree. It would be found in the person himself. The theme appears throughout the Gospels. God's kingdom subverts human expectations. The first become last. The exalted are humbled. The weak shame the strong. A Messiah from Nazareth fits this pattern perfectly. The very thing that seems to disqualify him becomes evidence of divine logic at work. Paul would later make this theological move explicit in his letters. God chose what is foolish to shame the wise. God chose what is weak to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised to bring to nothing things that are. The incarnation in Nazareth embodied this principle. Still, the practical challenge remained. Early Christian missionaries had to overcome the stigma. Jewish audiences especially struggled with it. The Messiah was supposed to come in power and glory, restoring David's throne. Instead, they were being told he came from a village so insignificant that most Jews had never heard of it. The Romans faced different objections. They viewed provincial origins with contempt. Someone claiming divine status should come from Rome, or at least Athens or Alexandria. Nazareth wasn't even a proper city by Roman standards. It was a cluster of peasant dwellings, the kind of place imperial citizens would pass through without noticing. These objections never disappeared. They were absorbed into the Christian story as features rather than bugs. The humility of the incarnation became a selling point. God didn't come as a conquering emperor. He came as a carpenter from a nothing village. The shock of it was the point. Archaeological work in Nazareth over the past century has confirmed the ancient sources. This was indeed a tiny settlement, barely distinguishable from dozens of other agricultural villages in the region. Excavations have uncovered modest homes, agricultural installations, and evidence of subsistence level existence. Nothing suggests wealth, importance, or influence. One discovery stands out: a stone inscription from the 3rd or 4th century listing priestly courses assigned to various towns. Nazareth appears on this list, confirming its existence and its Jewish character. But the very fact that such a late inscription was needed speaks volumes. Nazareth had to be remembered and recorded because it was so easily forgotten. The question Nathanael asked has echoed through 2 millennia. Can anything good come from Nazareth? The Christian answer is that the best thing that ever was came from Nazareth. The very obscurity that made the claim seem absurd became evidence of its truth. God doesn't play by human rules. He doesn't need impressive credentials or important addresses. The carpenter from the forgotten village became the most influential person in human history. Nazareth, the town synonymous with insignificance, gave its name to the movement that would transform the world. The joke became the punchline to a different story than anyone expected. The Nazarene disciples, the brothers and sisters of Jesus. Growing up with someone who would later claim to be the Son of God must have been complicated. The Gospels give us glimpses into Jesus's family life, and the picture that emerges is far from simple. He had brothers, James, Joses, Judas, and Simon. He had sisters, unnamed in the texts. They all lived together in that small Nazareth home, sharing meals and chores and the rhythms of village life. But somewhere along the way, a divide opened. The family that should have been his strongest supporters became his skeptics. Mark's gospel preserves an uncomfortable moment. Jesus was teaching, drawing such crowds that he couldn't even eat. When his family heard about this, they went to seize him, saying, "He is out of his mind." The Greek phrase is even stronger. They thought he had lost his senses, become possessed or deranged. This wasn't gentle concern. This was intervention. His family believed something had gone wrong, that Jesus needed to be brought home and restrained before he embarrassed himself and them further. The shame of having a family member act strangely in public would have been acute in 1st century village culture. Later in the same chapter, his mother and brothers arrived, calling for him from outside the house where he was teaching. When someone told Jesus his family was waiting, his response must have cut deeply. "Who are my mother and my brothers?" Then, looking at those seated around him, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother." The statement redefined family around shared mission rather than shared blood. For his biological family standing outside, hearing this secondhand, the rejection must have stung. John's Gospel adds another detail. During the Feast of Tabernacles, Jesus' brothers urged him to go to Judea and show himself publicly. No one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. The narrator adds a crucial note, for not even his brothers believed in him. The psychology here is revealing. They acknowledged Jesus was doing remarkable things, but they didn't believe his claims about himself. The disconnect between what they saw him do and what he said about his identity created cognitive dissonance. He performed signs, yes, but the Messiah, the Son of God, that seemed like madness. James stands out among the brothers as particularly significant. The New Testament letter bearing his name identifies him as a servant of Jesus Christ, but makes no mention of their biological relationship. This silence speaks loudly. James didn't claim authority based on being Jesus' brother. He claimed it based on being Jesus' servant. What changed? What transformed James from skeptic to leader? Paul provides the crucial detail. In his list of resurrection appearances in 1 Corinthians 15, he mentions that the risen Jesus appeared to James specifically. This private encounter isn't recorded in the Gospels, but its impact was profound. The brother who once thought Jesus was deranged became the pillar of the Jerusalem church. Acts portrays James as a central figure in the early Christian community. When Peter had to explain his ministry to Gentiles, he reported to James. When Paul came to Jerusalem, he met with James. When the church faced its first major controversy about including Gentiles, James delivered the decisive speech. The carpenter's brother had become the movement's anchor. The transformation wasn't just personal, it was theological. James had to reconcile everything he thought he knew about his brother with the impossible claim of resurrection. He had grown up with Jesus. He knew Jesus' childhood, his quirks, his humanity. To accept that this same person was Lord required a complete reorientation of reality. Josephus, writing later in the first century, mentions James's death. Around 62 AD, during a power vacuum in Jerusalem, the high priest Ananus had James stoned as a lawbreaker. Josephus describes James as the brother of Jesus who was called Christ, confirming both the relationship and Jesus' messianic identification from an outside source. Another brother, Judas, also called Jude, wrote the short epistle that bears his name. Like James, he identifies himself as a servant of Jesus Christ and brother of James. Again, the biological connection to Jesus goes unmentioned. What mattered wasn't kinship, but discipleship. The letter of Jude tackles false teachers who had infiltrated the church. His tone is fierce, uncompromising. He quotes ancient texts and makes bold theological claims. This was no longer the skeptical brother standing outside the house in Nazareth. This was a defender of the faith, willing to fight for the message his brother had proclaimed. Early church tradition holds that several of Jesus' brothers became missionaries. Hegesippus, a 2nd century Christian writer, claims that Jesus' relatives were examined by Roman authorities because of their Davidic ancestry. The grandsons of Judas appeared before Emperor Domitian, but were released when they proved to be simple farmers, not political threats. The fact that Jesus' family became known as the Nazarene sect's leaders is striking. In Jewish culture, family authority typically passed to the eldest son. But James wasn't the eldest. Jesus was. Yet after the resurrection, James inherited leadership. The movement founded by one brother was sustained by another. This created an interesting dynamic in early Christianity. The Nazarene Church in Jerusalem, led by Jesus' biological family, a Jewish expression of the faith. They maintained Torah observance, worshipped at the temple, and saw themselves as a renewal movement within Judaism. Meanwhile, Paul and others were preaching to Gentiles, creating communities that looked quite different. The tension between these approaches surfaces throughout Acts and Paul's letters. How much Jewish law should Gentile converts follow? Could Jews and Gentiles eat together? The council described in Acts 15, where James played a decisive role, addressed these questions. The compromise reached reflected James' wisdom and authority. Archaeological evidence from Jerusalem includes ossuaries from the 1st century. One, discovered in 1953, bears the inscription, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. The authenticity of this particular artifact has been debated, with questions about whether the final phrase might be a later addition, but it reflects the historical reality that Jesus' family was known and remembered in the Jerusalem community. The Nazarenes, as they were called, remained a distinct group within Christianity for several centuries. The term referred specifically to Jewish Christians who maintained Torah observance while believing in Jesus as Messiah. Church fathers like Jerome mention them, sometimes critically, as holding to practices that most Christians had abandoned. But the original Nazarenes, Jesus' own brothers and sisters, faced a unique challenge. They had to bridge two identities that seemed incompatible. Jesus was their brother, someone they had argued with and laughed with and lived beside. He was also their Lord, someone who had conquered death and now deserved worship. The transformation of Jesus' siblings from skeptics to leaders stands as one of the most remarkable aspects of the early church story. People don't usually follow their brothers as divine figures. The fact that James, Judas, and the others did suggests something extraordinary happened. The resurrection wasn't just a doctrine they accepted. It was an experience that shattered and remade their understanding of reality. Mary, Jesus' mother, appears occasionally in these narratives. After initially going to seize Jesus with his brothers, she later appears among the disciples in the upper room, waiting for the Spirit at Pentecost. The mother who had pondered mysterious things in her heart now watched as those mysteries unfolded in ways she couldn't have imagined. The Nazareth family that once struggled to understand Jesus became the Jerusalem community that proclaimed him. The brothers who once stood outside calling for him now stood as pillars in his church. The transformation was complete, not because they abandoned their skepticism easily, but because they encountered something that couldn't be explained away. James would die in Jerusalem, stoned for his faith. Judas would write warnings about false teachers threatening the church. The sisters remain unnamed in history, though tradition suggests some became followers as well. The family from Nazareth, scattered by mission and martyrdom, left a legacy that outlasted them. They proved that knowing Jesus personally didn't automatically mean understanding him. They showed that even those closest to him had to make a choice about who he was. And they demonstrated that when that choice is made, it changes everything. The skeptical brothers became faithful servants. The hometown became irrelevant. The message became all that mattered. Archaeology of Nazareth, unearthing the hometown of Jesus. The ground beneath Nazareth holds secrets that have taken centuries to reveal. Unlike Jerusalem, which has been continuously inhabited and venerated for millennia, Nazareth remained largely undeveloped until modern times. This obscurity became an archaeological gift. When excavations finally began in earnest, they uncovered a remarkably intact picture of a first-century Galilean village. The first serious archaeological work in Nazareth began in 1955 when the Franciscan Custody of the Holy Land undertook excavations beneath the Church of the Annunciation. What they found validated the gospel accounts while complicating our romantic notions of the place. The remains revealed a tiny agricultural hamlet carved into limestone hillsides. Houses from Jesus' era were found cut directly into the rock, following the natural contours of the terrain. These weren't freestanding structures of wood and stone. They were cave-like dwellings with a single entrance, expanded naturally occurring caves or carved spaces in the soft limestone. One structure stands out. Beneath the Church of the Annunciation, archaeologists uncovered a complex of rooms centered on a grotto or cave. Byzantine-era Christian inscriptions cover the walls, including the Greek phrase, Hail Mary, and references to a Christian place of worship. The veneration clearly dates back centuries before the current church was built. Whether this specific site was Mary's home remains debatable. What's clear is that Christians in the Byzantine period believed it was, and they built successive churches over the spot to mark it. The layers of construction tell a story of continuous reverence. The current basilica, completed in 1969, is the fifth church built on this location. Near the Church of St. Joseph, more domestic structures emerged during excavations in the 20th century. These include grain silos, cisterns for water storage, and oil presses carved into bedrock. The archaeological picture shows a community focused on processing agricultural products, particularly olives and grain. One home, dated to the late Hellenistic or early Roman period, included a courtyard with storage areas and living spaces arranged around it. The construction is simple: undressed stone walls, packed earth floors, and roofs that would have been made from wooden beams covered with clay and thatch. These weren't elegant homes. They were functional shelters built by people with limited resources. The limestone terrain of Nazareth made this style of architecture practical. Soft enough to carve, but stable enough to create lasting structures, the rock provided both building material and the buildings themselves. Families would expand their living space by digging deeper into the hillside as children were born and needs grew. In 2009, excavations ahead of construction for a visitors' center made a remarkable discovery. Archaeologists uncovered a first-century house beneath what had been a courtyard. The structure included walls of stone and mud brick, a courtyard with a cistern, and several rooms with doors hewn from stone. Most significantly, the building's style and artifacts date it firmly to the time of Jesus. This discovery generated headlines as the house where Jesus grew up. Such claims go beyond what archaeology can prove. But what the site does demonstrate is what typical housing looked like in Nazareth during the first century. Whether Jesus lived in this specific house or one essentially identical to it matters less than understanding the environment that shaped him. The artifacts found in Nazareth's domestic contexts tell their own story. Pottery fragments include storage jars, cooking pots, and oil lamps, typical of Jewish households in the period. Stone vessels, preferred by Jews for their ritual purity, advantages over pottery, appear frequently. Whoever lived here maintained Jewish religious customs. What's absent is equally telling: no mosaic floors, no frescoed walls, no imported fine pottery or luxury goods. The material culture reflects subsistence level existence, families producing most of what they needed and trading locally for the rest. A tomb complex on the hillside northeast of the village center has been known for centuries. Cut into the rock, it contains several burial chambers with coke-type graves. These are horizontal shafts carved into chamber walls where bodies were laid. The style is distinctively Jewish and dates to the Roman period. The location of this tomb complex matters. Jewish law required burials outside living areas. The fact that these tombs sit where they do helps establish the boundaries of the first century village. They mark where the settlement ended and the burial ground began. In 1962, excavations at the Sisters of Nazareth convent revealed additional first century remains. These included a rock-cut tomb later incorporated into a Byzantine church complex. Here again, the pattern emerges. Early Christians identified specific locations as holy sites and built churches over them, creating layers of veneration. One of the most controversial archaeological finds connected to Nazareth came from Caesarea Maritima, not Nazareth itself. A marble fragment, dated to the 3rd or 4th century, was discovered in 1962. It contained a Hebrew inscription listing the priestly courses and their assigned towns. Nazareth appears on this list, assigned to the priestly course of Hapazes. This inscription, known as the Caesarea inscription, provides the first non-Christian archaeological evidence for Nazareth's existence. After the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, priestly families dispersed to towns throughout Galilee. That Nazareth received one of these families confirms it was a known Jewish settlement. Recent excavations in 2020 at the site of the planned Sisters of Nazareth Center uncovered more dwellings and agricultural installations. The findings continue to support the picture of a small agricultural village with a population in the low hundreds during the 1st century. One installation, identified as a wine or oil press, featured a large stone basin with channels for collecting liquid. The presence of multiple such installations suggests Nazareth participated in regional agricultural trade, even if on a modest scale. Terrace systems carved into the hillsides around Nazareth also date to the Roman period. These agricultural terraces maximized arable land in the hilly terrain, allowing families to grow grains, olives, and grapes on slopes that would otherwise be useless. The labor required to build and maintain these terraces speaks to the industriousness of Nazareth's inhabitants. Water supply always poses challenges in Galilee's limestone hills. Nazareth's ancient residents relied on cisterns carved into bedrock to collect rainwater. One well, still known today as Mary's Well, has provided water since ancient times. Though the current structure dates to much later periods, the spring itself fed the village in Jesus' day. The synagogue where Jesus would have studied and later taught has not been conclusively identified. No first-century synagogue remains have been found in Nazareth, though this isn't surprising. Early Galilean synagogues were often simple structures, easily destroyed or built over in subsequent centuries. The synagogue could have been a modest building or even a room in someone's home. Archaeological surveys of the broader Nazareth basin reveal that the village sat among other small settlements, forming a cluster of Jewish communities in Lower Galilee. Jaffa, and other villages mentioned in historical sources lay within an hour's walk. This network of settlements would have shared resources, marriages, and news. The total area of first-century Nazareth is estimated at about 4 hectares, roughly 10 acres. This tiny footprint aligns with population estimates of 200 to 400 people. The village would have been traversable in minutes, every resident known to every other resident. Critics have occasionally claimed that Nazareth didn't exist in the 1st century, that it was invented by gospel writers. Archaeological evidence decisively refutes these claims. The pottery, the housing styles, the agricultural installations, the tomb complexes, and the Caesarea inscription all confirm a modest Jewish settlement exactly where the Gospels say Jesus grew up. What archaeology cannot prove is any specific connection to Jesus or his family. No artifact says Jesus was here. No inscription identifies Mary's house. The locations venerated by Christian tradition may or may not be accurate. But what archaeology does provide is context, the material reality of life in a first century Galilean village. The houses were small and dark, the work was hard and constant, the diet was simple, the possessions were few. This was the environment that shaped the man who would reshape the world. The archaeology makes the humanity of Jesus more concrete. He lived in actual rooms with actual dimensions. He walked on actual stone floors. He drank from actual cisterns. The challenge for modern pilgrims and scholars alike is holding together the ordinary and the extraordinary. The archaeology shows us the ordinary with brutal clarity. This was a poor, small, unremarkable place. But within that ordinariness, Christians believe something extraordinary occurred. God became human, and he did it here in rooms like these, among people who lived like this. Recent technological advances have allowed archaeologists to survey Nazareth without extensive excavation. Ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive techniques reveal structures still buried beneath the modern city. As Nazareth has grown, especially in the 20th and 21st centuries, development has both threatened and revealed ancient remains. The tension between preservation and progress continues. Modern Nazareth is a bustling city of over 75,000 people, most of them Arab citizens. Ancient remains lie beneath homes, shops, and streets. Each new construction project creates potential for discovery and destruction alike. The churches built over traditional holy sites serve as both monuments and museums. They protect the ancient remains beneath them while making bold theological claims about those remains. Walking through the Church of the Annunciation, visitors encounter layers: the modern basilica, the Byzantine church, the Crusader church, and finally the rock-cut rooms of the Roman period. Each layer represents a different community's faith response to the same story. Each generation built over the previous one, not to erase, but to honor. The cumulative effect is a physical palimpsest, stories written on top of stories, all pointing to events believed to have happened in the limestone caves below. What emerges from Nazareth's archaeology is a picture both humble and profound. This was not a place of kings or monuments. It was a place of farmers and craftsmen, of families surviving on the margins of the Roman Empire. The grandeur would come later, built by believers looking back. But in the beginning, there was just a village and a boy growing up within it. The ground keeps yielding secrets. Each excavation adds detail to our understanding. And through it all, the central question remains: how did this place produce the person who would transform human history? The archaeology gives us the setting. The answer, if there is one, lies beyond what stones and pottery can tell, beyond the Bible, Nazareth in early extra-biblical sources. For decades after Jesus' death, Nazareth appears nowhere outside Christian writings. The silence is striking. No Roman records mention it. Jewish sources ignore it. The village remained beneath the notice of historians and chroniclers. This absence has fueled skeptics while puzzling believers. If Jesus was so significant, why didn't anyone write about his hometown? The answer lies partly in Nazareth's insignificance. Ancient writers focused on cities of political, economic, or military importance. A village of 200 peasants in the Galilean hills offered nothing worth recording. The silence tells us not that Nazareth didn't exist, but that it didn't matter to anyone keeping records. The first non-Christian reference to Nazareth comes from an unexpected source, an inscription found at Caesarea Maritima. Discovered in 1962 during excavations of an ancient synagogue, this marble fragment dates to the 3rd or 4th century. Written in Hebrew, it lists the 24 priestly courses and the towns in Galilee where they resettled after the destruction of Jerusalem. The 18th course, Hapases, was assigned to Nazareth. This simple administrative record confirms what Christians had been saying for centuries. Nazareth existed and was recognized as a Jewish settlement. The inscription matters because it comes from a Jewish context completely independent of Christian claims. After the failed Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 AD, Emperor Hadrian banned Jews from Jerusalem. The priestly families, guardians of temple traditions even after the temple's destruction, scattered throughout Galilee. That they would note which families went where makes sense. These records preserved their heritage and organizational structure in exile. The fact that Nazareth was chosen as a destination for a priestly family suggests it was an established Jewish community, however small. Priestly families maintained strict purity requirements. They wouldn't relocate to places with questionable Jewish credentials. Julius Africanus, a Christian writer from the 3rd century, provides another early reference. In a letter to Aristides, he discusses the genealogies of Jesus. Africanus mentions that relatives of Jesus, called desposinoi, those belonging to the master, lived in Jewish villages including Nazareth and Kokaba. They preserved genealogical records proving their Davidic descent. This passage is significant because Africanus was collecting information about Jewish Christian communities still existing in Galilee 2 centuries after Jesus. His mention of Nazareth assumes readers know it's Jesus' hometown, but he's describing it as a real place with real inhabitants, not a theological symbol. Origen, the prolific 3rd century theologian, mentions Nazareth in his writings. In his work Against Celsus, he responds to pagan criticisms of Christianity. Celsus had mocked Jesus' obscure origins. Origen doesn't dispute Nazareth's insignificance. Instead, he argues that God choosing to work through humble means demonstrates divine wisdom rather than weakness. This exchange reveals that by the 3rd century, Nazareth's obscurity was being used as ammunition against Christian claims. Critics pointed to the village's insignificance as evidence that Jesus couldn't be who Christians claimed. Defenders had to explain why God would choose such an unlikely location. The Talmud, compiled over several centuries but containing traditions from the 1st century onward, mentions Nazareth only obliquely. Some scholars identify references to Nazareth in passages that use similar-sounding Hebrew words, but these identifications remain contested. What's clear is that Nazareth held no significance in Rabbinic Judaism except as the hometown of the figure Christians worshipped. One Talmudic passage from the Babylonian Talmud tractate Sanhedrin mentions a certain Jacob of Kephar Sekania who claimed to heal in the name of Yeshu ben Pantera. Scholars debate whether Kephar Sekania could be a reference to Nazareth and whether this Yeshu is Jesus. The evidence is ambiguous, but it shows that by the time the Talmud was compiled, rabbinic authorities were aware of healing claims associated with someone named Yeshu. Epiphanius, a 4th century bishop, provides more substantial information. In his work Panarion, he describes various heresies, including Jewish Christian groups. He mentions the Nazorians, a sect of Jewish believers in Jesus, who lived in the region around Nazareth. Epiphanius distinguishes them from other groups and notes their continued Torah observance. His account suggests that Nazareth remained associated with Jewish Christianity for centuries. The village was seen as a center for believers who maintained Jewish identity while following Jesus. This makes sense given that Jesus' own family had led the Jerusalem church before its destruction in 70 AD. Jerome, translating the Bible into Latin in the late 4th century, comments on Nazareth in his notes. He had traveled to Palestine and visited Christian holy sites. His description of Nazareth emphasizes its smallness. He calls it a very small village and notes that many Jews still lived there alongside Christians. Jerome's observation about the mixed population is significant. By the 4th century, Christianity had become the empire's dominant religion. Yet Nazareth apparently retained a substantial Jewish community. The village hadn't been transformed into a Christian pilgrimage center the way Bethlehem and Jerusalem had. The pilgrim Egeria, who traveled through the Holy Land around 384 AD, mentions Nazareth in her travel diary. She describes visiting a cave identified as the site of the Annunciation. Local Christians showed her the place where they believed Mary had lived. Egeria's account is valuable because it shows Christian veneration of Nazareth sites was established by the late 4th century. Later pilgrims added their own accounts. The Piacenza pilgrim, traveling around 570 AD, describes Nazareth as having a synagogue where Jesus was educated. He mentions that the bench where Jesus sat was still shown to visitors. Whether authentic or not, these traditions show how the village was being remembered and mythologized. Notably absent from most early sources is any claim that Nazareth was invented. Even critics of Christianity who mocked its origins didn't question whether Nazareth existed. They questioned whether anything significant could come from such a place. The village's existence was accepted. Its importance was what people argued about. The so-called Nazareth inscription or Nazareth decree deserves mention, though its connection to Nazareth is dubious. This marble tablet, now in the Library of France, contains a Greek edict from a Roman emperor forbidding the disturbance of tombs. It was reportedly found in Nazareth in 1878. Some scholars once theorized this decree was issued in response to Christian claims about Jesus' empty tomb. More recent scholarship dates the inscription to the reign of Claudius and connects it to disturbances in Greece, not Palestine. The provenance from Nazareth is itself questionable. The inscription's only connection to the gospel story is coincidental. What strikes the careful observer is how late most extra-biblical references to Nazareth are. We don't get solid non-Christian attestation until the 3rd century at earliest. This gap has troubled some who want earlier confirmation. But the gap makes sense given Nazareth's profile. Villages this small and insignificant simply didn't make it into historical records unless something extraordinary happened there. And something extraordinary did happen there, according to Christians. But that extraordinary thing took decades to spread and generations to become culturally significant enough that historians paid attention. By the time Nazareth appeared in non-Christian sources, it appeared because Christianity had made it important, not because of any inherent significance. The early sources also reveal something about how Nazareth was used rhetorically. For Christians, it became proof of God's humility. For critics, it became evidence of Christianity's dubious origins. The tiny village became a symbol in competing narratives about what God does and how divine revelation works. Jewish sources' relative silence about Nazareth is harder to interpret. Some see it as deliberate avoidance, a refusal to give credence to Christian claims by acknowledging the place. Others note that rabbinic literature focused on legal matters and scriptural interpretation, not geography. A village in Galilee with no temple connection and no famous sages had no reason to appear in such texts. What we can say with confidence is that by the 3rd century, both Christian and non-Christian sources acknowledged Nazareth as a real place. The village's existence was not in dispute. What it meant, what had happened there, and whether those events had cosmic significance remained matters of fierce debate. The scarcity of early references actually strengthens rather than weakens the historical case. If Christians had invented Nazareth, they would have given it an impressive pedigree. They would have connected it to Hebrew scripture prophecies or claimed ancient patriarchs lived there. Instead, they were stuck defending why God would choose such an unremarkable place. The embarrassment factor, as scholars call it, suggests authenticity. People don't invent details that make their claims harder to defend. The Gospel's insistence that Jesus came from Nazareth, despite the credibility problems this created, points to the claim being grounded in fact rather than fabricated for theological purposes. As Christianity spread beyond Palestine, Nazareth receded in immediate importance. The theological doctrines mattered more than the geographical location. But for those who knew the region, who understood Galilean social hierarchies, Nazareth's mention triggered recognition. They knew exactly what kind of place was being discussed. The extra-biblical sources, sparse as they are, serve a limited but important function. They confirm the basic framework. Nazareth was a small Jewish village in Galilee. It existed in the 1st century, and it became significant because of its association with Jesus. Beyond that, the sources tell us more about how later generations remembered and argued about the place than about the place itself in Jesus' time. History often works this way. The most important events happen in obscure locations that only become notable in retrospect. Nazareth remained obscure longer than most. But once Christianity transformed the Roman Empire and beyond, even this forgotten village found its way into the historical record. The sources we do have, thin as they are, tell a consistent story. Nazareth was real, it was small, it was insignificant, and somehow it became the hometown of a figure who would split history into before and after. From obscurity to pilgrimage, Nazareth. After the resurrection. The years following Jesus' resurrection brought seismic shifts to the Jewish world. The destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD scattered communities and shattered expectations. The Bar Kokhba revolt's failure in 135 AD sealed Jerusalem's transformation into a Roman city forbidden to Jews. Against this backdrop of catastrophe and displacement, Nazareth's story entered a new chapter. For the first few generations after Jesus' death, Nazareth remained what it had always been, a small agricultural village. The difference was that now it held sacred significance for a growing movement of Jesus' followers. Jewish believers, fleeing Jerusalem's destruction, spread throughout Galilee. Some returned to ancestral villages. Others sought refuge in communities sympathetic to their message. Nazareth became one center of this dispersed Jewish Christianity. The relatives of Jesus, the desposinoi, maintained presence in the region. These family members carried special authority in early Christian communities, linking believers to Jesus through direct biological connection. Their testimony about Jesus' life in Nazareth would have been treasured. Epiphanius, writing in the 4th century, describes a Jewish Christian sect called the Nazorians who lived in the region. These believers maintained Jewish law while following Jesus. They were distinct from Gentile Christians in practice, but united in faith. Nazareth itself apparently retained a mixed population of Jews, Jewish Christians, and eventually Gentile Christians. The earliest Christian structures in Nazareth were likely modest. Jewish Christian worship initially centered on homes and adapted spaces rather than purpose-built churches. The synagogue tradition of communal gathering in designated rooms influenced early Christian practice. In a village as small as Nazareth, the entire Christian community could meet in a single large home. The tradition identifying certain locations as sacred sites began early. Pilgrims in later centuries reported being shown the place of the Annunciation, the site of Joseph's workshop, and other locations associated with Jesus' life. Some of these traditions may preserve genuine memory. Others likely developed as pious speculation filled gaps in knowledge. The Constantinian Revolution in the early 4th century transformed Christian fortunes throughout the empire. With imperial backing, Christians could build publicly and worship openly. Helena, Constantine's mother, traveled to Palestine around 326 AD, identifying and marking sacred sites. Though later tradition attributes many church foundations to her, the historical record is less clear about Nazareth. The first substantial church in Nazareth appears to date from the Byzantine period, probably the 4th or 5th century. Built over the grotto traditionally identified as Mary's home, this church established the pattern that would continue through subsequent eras. Each new church would be built over the previous one, creating layers of devotion and architecture. Byzantine-era pilgrims left accounts of their visits. The Piacenza pilgrim, traveling around 570 AD, describes what he saw. The Church of the Annunciation, the synagogue where Jesus studied, the bench where Jesus sat. Some of these were undoubtedly authentic locations. Others were products of enthusiastic tradition, willing to identify relics and sites based on minimal evidence. What's remarkable is that Nazareth never became a major pilgrimage destination in the Byzantine period. Jerusalem dominated Christian attention. Bethlehem drew pilgrims to the birthplace narrative. Sites around the Sea of Galilee commemorated Jesus' ministry. Nazareth remained relatively quiet, visited by some, but never achieving the status of greater sites. The Persian invasion of 614 AD devastated many churches throughout Palestine. Whether Nazareth's churches suffered destruction is unclear from surviving sources. The subsequent Arab conquest in the 7th century brought new challenges. Christian communities found themselves living under Muslim rule, their sacred sites subject to new political and religious dynamics. Under early Islamic rule, Christians were generally tolerated as people of the book. Churches that existed could remain, though building new ones faced restrictions. Nazareth's Christian community survived, maintaining worship at their traditional sites. The village itself remained small, its population mixed between Christians, Muslims, and possibly some Jews. The Crusader period brought dramatic change. When Latin Christians conquered Palestine in 1099, they set about rebuilding churches at sacred sites. In Nazareth, Crusaders constructed a grand basilica over the Byzantine ruins. This church, completed in 1170, was among the finest Crusader buildings in the Holy Land. Its blend of Romanesque and local architectural styles demonstrated both European influence and adaptation to local conditions. Crusader Nazareth also saw construction of additional churches. The Church of St. Joseph was built near the Church of the Annunciation. A church commemorating the synagogue where Jesus taught was erected. The village transformed from a modest settlement to a small pilgrimage town, its economy increasingly dependent on religious tourism. This period proved brief. After Saladin's victory at the Battle of Hadden in 1187, Crusader control of Galilee collapsed. Nazareth fell to Muslim forces. The churches were not destroyed, but were converted to other uses or simply closed. The Latin Christian population fled or was dispersed. For the next several centuries, Nazareth reverted to quiet obscurity. Under Mamluk and later Ottoman rule, it was a village like many others. Christian communities survived, but faced periodic restrictions and hardships. The Grand Crusader churches fell into disrepair, their elaborate stonework crumbling as roofs collapsed and walls eroded. The Franciscan custody of the Holy Land, granted authority over Catholic sites in the region, worked to maintain a presence in Nazareth. By the 17th century, Franciscans had secured permission to conduct services at the ruined Church of the Annunciation. They gradually repaired and rebuilt portions of the structure, working within the constraints of Ottoman regulations. The 18th and 19th centuries saw slow growth in Nazareth's Christian population. Various Christian denominations established communities and built churches. The Greek Orthodox Church constructed a church over a spring they identified as the true site of the Annunciation. The Greek Catholics, Maronites, and other Eastern Christian communities built their own houses of worship. European interest in Palestine grew through the 19th century. Pilgrims traveled in increasing numbers, their journeys made easier by improved transportation. Nazareth became a standard stop on the Holy Land circuit. Writers published accounts of their visits, describing the village, its churches, and its mixed population. Mark Twain, visiting in 1867, described Nazareth as a squalid little town with narrow streets and poor houses. His account, while tinged with typical Twain skepticism, captures something of the village's reality. Despite its sacred associations, Nazareth remained materially poor, its residents living much as their ancestors had centuries before. The late 19th century brought systematic archaeological interest. European scholars began studying Palestine's ancient sites scientifically rather than simply seeking to confirm biblical narratives. Nazareth attracted attention as Jesus' hometown, though excavations remained limited. The early 20th century brought political upheaval. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire after World War I placed Palestine under British mandate. This period saw competing nationalisms and religious tensions rise. Nazareth, with its mixed population of Arab Christians and Muslims, navigated these tensions with varying success. In 1955, work began on a new basilica to replace the deteriorating structure over the Annunciation Grotto. The project, completed in 1969, created the current Church of the Annunciation. Modern in design, yet incorporating elements from earlier churches, it towers over Nazareth, a visible statement of Christian presence. The building's excavation phase revealed substantial remains from earlier periods, Byzantine mosaics, Crusader capitals, and beneath it all, the rock-cut rooms of the Roman village. These discoveries confirmed the site's long history of veneration while providing physical evidence of Nazareth's humble origins. Modern Nazareth is a bustling city of over 75,000 people, the largest Arab city in the region. The ancient village center is now surrounded by modern neighborhoods sprawling across the hills. Churches from various denominations dot the cityscape, each representing a different strand of Christianity's complex history. The pilgrimage industry remains economically significant. Hundreds of thousands of visitors arrive annually, touring the sacred sites, purchasing religious souvenirs, and connecting with their faith's origins. The city has grown to accommodate this traffic, with hotels, restaurants, and tour services catering to religious travelers. Yet tension persists between the sacred and the mundane. Nazareth is a living city with schools, businesses, traffic jams, and all the complications of modern urban life. It's not a museum frozen in time, but a place where people live, work, and navigate contemporary challenges. The transformation from obscure village to pilgrimage destination took centuries. It happened not because of anything inherent to the place, but because believers invested it with meaning. The stones and soil of Nazareth are no different than stones and soil anywhere. What makes them sacred is the story people tell about what happened there. This pattern repeats throughout Christian history. Ordinary places become extraordinary through association with divine activity. The claim that God works through material reality, through specific times and places, inevitably creates sacred geography. Nazareth stands as perhaps the prime example of this dynamic. From the village that shaped Jesus to the destination that shapes pilgrims, Nazareth's journey reflects Christianity's own development. Both began small and marginalized. Both faced rejection and persecution. Both spread far beyond their origins while maintaining connection to that specific place in Lower Galilee. The modern visitor to Nazareth encounters layers of history and meaning. Ancient stones, medieval churches, modern streets. Each layer tells part of the story. Each represents a community's attempt to honor what they believed happened in this place 2,000 years ago. Whether the specific sites identified by tradition are accurate matters less than the broader truth they represent. Somewhere in this small corner of Galilee, a child grew up who would change the world. The precise location of his home may be uncertain. That he had a home in a real place among real people is fundamental to Christian claims about the incarnation. Nazareth's transformation from obscurity to pilgrimage destination reminds us that significance is not inherent, but assigned. Places matter because of what happens in them, and because communities decide to remember. The village that once could barely register on historical maps now draws believers from every continent. The journey continues. Each generation adds its layer to Nazareth's story, interpreting and reinterpreting what this place means. And beneath it all, the limestone bedrock remains. The same stone that witnessed a carpenter and his son working in wood, a family eating simple meals, a boy learning Torah in the synagogue.